On Thanksgiving morning, he found her sleeping in his barn with a baby. "You're home now." Thanksgiving morning came in quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears until you noticed your own breathing. Winter had settled early that year, hard and unapologetic, frosting the fields and turning the fence posts into pale sentinels. The sky was a dull pewter gray, heavy with the promise of more snow, and the air smelled like cold iron and old hay. Ethan Cole woke before dawn, like he always did. Not because he wanted to, but because his body no longer understood rest the way it used to. He lay still for a moment, staring at the low wooden ceiling of the farmhouse bedroom, listening to the wind worry at the eaves. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked under the weight of ice. Thanksgiving. The word meant very little now. It was just another date on the calendar, another reminder of the years that had slipped past him while he stayed rooted to this land. Still, habit pulled him from bed. He dressed in layers, flannel, wool, the old coat that smelled faintly of smoke and horses, and stepped outside before the sun had fully decided whether it would rise. The cold met him like a slap. It crawled up his boots, bit at his knuckles, found the soft places behind his ears. Ethan welcomed it. Cold was honest. It didn't pretend to be kind. The barn stood a short walk from the house, its dark shape hunched against the white field like an animal trying to survive the night. He could see his breath as he crossed the yard, boots crunching over frozen ground. Snow creaked underfoot, that brittle sound that only came when the temperature dropped low enough to make everything feel fragile. He was halfway there when he noticed the door. It was open, not wide, just enough to matter. Ethan stopped. His heart did something small and sharp in his chest. He was careful with this place, always had been. Doors latched, tools put away. Routines followed with near-religious precision. Disorder had a way of inviting trouble, and he'd learned long ago that trouble never needed much encouragement. He rested a hand on the barn door and pushed it open slowly. The smell hit him first. Hay, animals, and something else. Something warmer. Human. Light filtered through the high slats, pale and thin. Dust motes floated in the air, suspended like they were afraid to move. The horses shifted in their stalls, snorting softly, but they weren't agitated. That, more than anything, kept Ethan from reaching for the old shotgun mounted near the door. And then he saw her. She was curled up in the far corner, half hidden behind stacked bales of hay. A woman, young by the look of her, though the cold and exhaustion blurred the lines of age. Her dark hair spilled across her face and down her shoulders, tangled and dull. She wore a coat that was far too thin for this weather, wrapped tight around herself like a final defense. And in her arms, Ethan sucked in a breath without meaning to. A baby. The child was nestled against her chest, impossibly small, a knit cap pulled low over its head. Its tiny hand peeked out from the blanket, pink and clenched, rising and falling with shallow, steady breaths. Both of them were asleep, not the soft sleep of comfort, but the heavy, collapsed kind that came after fear and cold had taken everything else. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. The barn felt different now, smaller, like the walls had leaned in to listen. His mind raced through 1,000 questions. How? Why? Where did you come from? But none of them felt right to ask in this space, at this moment. This wasn't a mystery yet. It was a fact. A living, breathing fact, shivering in the corner of his barn on Thanksgiving morning. He stepped closer, careful not to make noise. The boards creaked anyway, betraying him. The woman stirred, her brow furrowing even in sleep. Her arm tightened instinctively around the baby. Ethan froze. "It's all right," he murmured, before he could stop himself, his voice low, rough with disuse. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd spoken aloud to another person. Her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, wide, alert in an instant, like someone who had learned the hard way that waking up was dangerous. Her gaze locked onto him, sharp with fear, and she shifted, angling her body protectively around the baby. "I'm not here to hurt you," Ethan said quickly, holding up his hands. "This is my barn. I didn't know anyone was here." She said nothing, just watched him, her breathing shallow, her fingers digging into the thin blanket around the child. Up close he could see the signs, the cracked lips, the faint blue tinge at the edges of her skin where the cold had settled too long. The baby let out a soft sound, a whimper no louder than the wind slipping through the boards. Ethan swallowed. "You'll freeze out here," he said, softer now. "Both of you will." Still no answer. He hesitated, then slowly shrugged out of his coat and held it out, not stepping any closer. The fabric looked enormous in his hands, heavy and worn, lined with years of work and solitude. "Please," he said. The woman stared at the coat, then back at his face. Something shifted in her expression, not trust, not yet, but calculation, survival weighing its options. Finally, she reached out with one trembling hand and took it. As she pulled the coat around herself and the baby, her shoulders sagged, just a little, like she'd been holding herself upright on will alone and had finally allowed it to crack. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You're home now," he said, the words leaving his mouth before he'd fully understood them himself. The baby sighed in its sleep. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of snow. Inside the barn, surrounded by old wood and animals and breath, something fragile and dangerous had just begun. Ethan didn't move for a long time after she took the coat. The barn seemed to breathe around them, horses shifting, hay settling, the low creak of wood tightening against the cold. Snow began to whisper against the roof, light at first, like it was testing whether it was welcome. The woman's eyes never left him. Up close, Ethan could see how young she was. Not a girl, but not far from it. There were shadows under her eyes that didn't belong to her age, lines drawn there by nights without sleep and days without certainty. Her face was pale from the cold, but there was color blooming back into her cheeks now that she was wrapped in warmth. He took a step back, giving her space. "There's a house," he said. "Heated, not fancy, but it's solid. You can stay there until you figure out what you want to do." She looked past him toward the open barn door, where the gray morning pressed in like a warning. Snow had begun to fall in earnest now, flakes thick and heavy, blurring the edges of the world. Her jaw tightened. The baby stirred again, this time opening its mouth in a small, soundless cry. She bent her head immediately, pressing her lips to the child's forehead, rocking slightly. The movement was practiced, instinctive, motherhood worn into her bones. Ethan felt something ache in his chest, old and unfamiliar. "There's food," he added, "warm food." That did it. She nodded once. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but it carried the weight of a decision. She shifted carefully, standing with effort, keeping the baby tucked close. Her knees wobbled, and Ethan stepped forward without thinking, catching her elbow. She flinched at the contact, but she didn't pull away. "Easy," he said. "I've got you." Her eyes flicked up to his, searching his face like she was looking for a lie and hoping not to find one. The walk to the house was slow. Ethan matched his pace to hers, snow crunching under their boots. He opened the door and ushered her inside, the warmth hitting them like a wall. The small living space smelled of wood smoke and coffee grounds, the stove already radiating heat from the fire he'd banked the night before. She stopped just inside the doorway, unsure, as if crossing that threshold carried rules she didn't know. "You can sit," Ethan said, nodding toward the table. "Or the couch, whatever's easier." She chose the chair closest to the stove, easing down with a sigh she didn't seem to realize she'd been holding. The baby made a soft noise, then settled again. Ethan poured water into a kettle and set it on the stove, his movements deliberate, steady. He moved like a man who had learned how to exist alone without thinking about it. Plates, bread, a small jar of honey he'd bought months ago and never opened. He set everything on the table, then stepped back. "Eat," he said. "Please." She hesitated, then shifted the baby slightly and reached for the bread. Her hands shook as she broke off a piece, dipping it into the honey. She took a bite, chewed slowly, and then something in her face changed. Not relief exactly, something closer to grief. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over silently as she swallowed. Ethan looked away, suddenly aware of how loud the room felt. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Thank you." He nodded. "You're welcome." They sat like that for a while, The only sound the crackle of the fire and the faint wind outside. Snow piled against the windows, turning the world into a blur of white. "My name is Ethan," he said eventually. It felt important to offer it, a way of meeting her halfway. She looked up at him. "Claire." The name landed softly between them. "And the baby?" he asked. She glanced down, her mouth curving into the faintest smile. "Lily." Ethan repeated it once, quietly. "Lily." The rest of the morning unfolded in careful fragments. He found an old quilt and wrapped it around them both. He showed her where the bathroom was, where the extra blankets were kept. She followed him with her eyes even when she didn't move, cataloging exits, listening for sounds. When noon came and went unnoticed, Ethan stepped outside to tend to the animals. The cold had deepened, snow falling thicker now, the sky lowering itself over the land. He worked quickly, hands stiff, mind restless. When he came back in, Claire was standing by the window, rocking Lily gently. The baby's eyes were open now, dark and curious, tracking movement with surprising focus. "She's strong," Ethan said before he thought better of it. Claire nodded. "She has to be." Something passed between them then, an understanding neither of them named. That afternoon, the storm worsened. Snow came sideways, driven by wind that howled like it had a grievance. The house creaked and groaned, but it held. Ethan kept the fire fed, kept the kettle warm. As dusk settled in, Claire finally seemed to relax enough to sit back, her head resting against the chair. Exhaustion claimed her again, her breathing evening out. Lily slept too, her tiny chest rising and falling under the quilt. Ethan watched them from across the room. He thought of the barn again, of how easily he might have gone in later that morning, how thin the line had been between this and something else entirely. Outside, the world disappeared beneath the storm. Inside, two strangers shared warmth and silence, both aware, in their own way, that whatever came next would change everything. Night settled early, dragged down by the storm. By the time the sun should have been setting, the light outside had already dimmed to a blue-gray haze, snow pressing against the windows like a living thing. The wind found every seam in the house, whistling low, then rising, as if testing how much it could take. Ethan added another log to the stove, and stood there a moment longer than necessary, watching the flames catch. Fire was a language he understood. It asked for patience. It rewarded attention. Behind him, Claire shifted in her sleep. She startled awake with a sharp inhale, her arms tightening instinctively around Lily. It took a second for her eyes to adjust, to remember where she was. The fear didn't vanish immediately. It never did, but it loosened its grip enough for her shoulders to lower. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, embarrassed by the reflex. Ethan shook his head. "Don't be." He poured hot water into 2 chipped mugs, dropped a tea bag into one, then hesitated before adding a second. He slid the mug toward her across the table. "It helps," he said, "with the cold." She wrapped her hands around it, sighing softly as the heat soaked into her palms. "Everything feels cold," she said. Not a complaint, just a fact. The baby stirred again, fussing this time, her small face scrunching as if she were offended by the world. Claire moved automatically, lifting her slightly, adjusting the blanket, humming under her breath. The sound was low and uneven, more memory than melody. Ethan watched, something quiet and reverent settling over him. "She hungry?" he asked. Claire nodded. "Soon." He looked toward the clock on the wall, its hands ticking with stubborn regularity. "You can take the bedroom," he said. "It's warmer in there. I'll sleep out here." She frowned. "You don't have to." "I know," he said gently, "but I want to." She studied him, weighing the offer the way she seemed to weigh everything. Finally, she nodded. "All right." Later, after she'd settled in the bedroom and the house had gone still again, Ethan lay on the couch staring at the ceiling. The storm howled outside, louder now, a full-throated thing that rattled the windows and sent snow piling high against the walls. Sleep didn't come easily. He thought of past winters, of other storms, of the years he'd learned how to listen to silence because there was nothing else to hear. This silence was different. It had weight. It had breath. Sometime in the early hours, Lily began to cry. It wasn't loud at first, just a thin, piercing sound that cut straight through him. Ethan sat up instantly, heart pounding, unsure whether to intervene or stay put. He waited, listening for Claire's voice. It didn't come. The cry sharpened, rising into panic. Ethan was on his feet before he realized he'd decided anything. He moved quietly down the short hall and knocked once, softly, on the bedroom door. "Claire?" he called. No answer. Just the baby's cries. Frantic now, he pushed the door open a crack. Claire was sitting on the edge of the bed, shoulders hunched, tears streaming silently down her face as she tried to soothe Lily. Her hands shook, her breathing uneven. I can't get her to stop," she whispered, voice breaking. "I don't know what I'm doing wrong." Ethan crossed the room without thinking. He crouched in front of her, careful, slow. "You're not doing anything wrong," he said. "She's just cold, or scared, or hungry. Babies don't know the difference yet." Claire laughed weakly through her tears. "I barely do." "May I?" he asked, nodding toward Lily. Claire hesitated, then handed her over. The baby was lighter than he expected, fragile, warm. Ethan felt clumsy, all thumbs and nerves, but he adjusted his hold the way he'd once seen his sister do years ago. Lily cried harder for a moment, offended by the change, then slowly, inexplicably, quieted. Ethan swayed slightly, rocking on his heels. "Hey," he murmured, voice barely audible. "It's all right." Claire watched, stunned. Lily's cries faded into small hiccuping breaths, then stopped entirely. Her tiny fingers curled into Ethan's shirt, gripping with surprising strength. "There," he said softly. "See?" Claire pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling again. This time, relief carried them. "Thank you," she whispered. He handed Lily back gently. "Any time." Claire lay back against the pillows, exhaustion reclaiming her. Ethan lingered a moment, then turned to leave. "Ethan?" she called quietly. He looked back. "I don't know how long I can stay," she said. "But thank you. For tonight. For everything." He nodded once. "You can stay as long as you need." Outside, the storm began to ease, the wind losing its edge, the snow falling straighter, calmer. By morning, the world would be buried, clean and unforgiving. Ethan returned to the couch and finally slept. When dawn came, it brought a strange, fragile peace. Snow blanketed everything, smoothing the land into soft curves and quiet edges. The sky was pale, almost hopeful. Claire stood at the window again, Lily bundled against her chest, watching the snow fall. Ethan joined her, handing her a mug of coffee. They stood shoulder to shoulder, silent. Thanksgiving morning had begun in solitude and ended in something else entirely, something uncertain, heavy, and alive. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both felt it. Winter had brought them together. What it would demand in return, neither of them yet knew. The days that followed folded into one another the way winter days often do, quiet, pale, and deliberate. Snow stopped falling but never truly left. It lingered on the fence rails, on the barn roof, on the wide backs of the hills like a held breath. The cold stayed constant, not vicious, not kind, just present. Ethan learned Claire's rhythms without meaning to. She woke before the baby cried, like her body anticipated the sound. She moved softly through the house, as if noise itself might break something fragile. She held Lily against her chest when she walked, one hand always resting between the baby's shoulders, grounding them both. She never went near the barn. Ethan noticed that too. He didn't ask about it. Some questions he'd learned did more harm than good when spoken too soon. They spoke in pieces, small exchanges, practical things. Where the extra blankets were, how long the generator usually lasted if the power went, which step on the porch creaked no matter how careful you were. Sometimes silence stretched between them. Not awkward, just heavy with unshared thought. At night, when the house settled and the wind dragged itself along the walls, Ethan lay awake listening. Claire cried once, late, muffling the sound into her pillow. He pretended not to hear, not because he didn't care, but because grief, like cold, needed room to move through a person without being trapped. On the fourth day, the storm returned. This one came harder, faster. Snow slammed sideways against the house, driven by a wind that sounded almost angry. The world shrank again, visibility dropping to nothing beyond the windows. Even the animals grew restless, stamping and shifting in the barn. Ethan was pulling on his coat when Claire appeared in the doorway, Lily bundled tight. "Do you need help?" she asked. He hesitated. "It's cold out there." "So is everything else," she said quietly. He nodded once. They moved together across the yard, the wind tearing at their clothes, snow stinging exposed skin. Claire stayed close to the house, holding Lily beneath her coat, but her eyes stayed on Ethan as he worked, latched doors, checked water, calmed the horses with low murmurs. When a sudden gust blew the barn door wider than it should have gone, Claire flinched hard. Ethan saw it. He closed the door firmly, securing it, then turned back to her. "You all right?" She nodded too quickly. "Yes." He didn't push. By the time they got back inside, both of them were flushed with cold. Ethan shook snow from his coat, then paused when he realized Claire was trembling, not from the temperature, but from something deeper, something held too long. "Sit," he said gently. She did, perching on the edge of the couch, Lily fussing softly in her arms. Ethan poured hot water, added honey, handed her the mug. Her hands shook so badly she almost spilled it. "I'm sorry," she said, frustration edging her voice. "I don't know why." "You don't have to explain," Ethan said. "Winter does things to people." She laughed once, hollow. "No, it was like this before winter." The words hung there. Ethan sat across from her, elbows on his knees. "If you want to tell me," he said, "I'll listen." Claire stared into the mug, watching the steam curl upward. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but her eyes were distant. "We were staying with friends," she said, "back east. Lily's father, he died before she was born. Accident. I thought I was safe there, but then things changed. People talk, they decide what you are, what you deserve." She swallowed. "I left in the middle of the night, took what I could carry. The car broke down days later. I walked after that, hitchhiked, slept where I could." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. "And the barn?" She nodded. "I saw the light from your house. I didn't think anyone would check the barn so early. I just needed one night, one warm night." Silence settled again, thicker now. "You don't owe me anything," Ethan said finally. "Not for staying, not for telling me." She looked up at him then, really looked. "Why are you helping us?" The question was careful, not accusatory, curious in the way of someone who'd learned to distrust kindness. Ethan leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Because I know what it's like to wake up somewhere you don't belong. And because—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Because this place has been empty a long time." Claire's gaze softened. The wind screamed outside, rattling the windows like it wanted in. That night the power went out. The house fell into sudden darkness, the hum of electricity replaced by the raw sound of the storm. Claire startled, clutching Lily close. Ethan moved immediately, lighting lanterns, steady and sure. "It'll come back," he said. "It always does." They sat by lantern light, shadows stretching tall against the walls. Lily slept, her small mouth parted, unaware of the world's tempests. Claire watched Ethan from across the room, the way he checked the stove, the windows, the locks. A man shaped by responsibility, by repetition. "You don't have a family?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "Not anymore." She nodded, understanding without needing details. The storm lasted through the night, relentless. At some point, exhaustion pulled them both under. Claire slept on the couch this time, Lily tucked against her. Ethan took the chair nearby, lantern dimmed low. In the early hours, Lily cried again. Claire stirred, disoriented, panic rising fast. Before it could take hold, Ethan was there, murmuring softly, steady as before. "You're all right," he said. "Both of you." Claire watched him calm her daughter with quiet competence, something easing inside her chest, trust, fragile and tentative, began to take shape. By morning the storm had broken. Sunlight spilled over fresh snow, bright and blinding, turning the world sharp and clean. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin line against the sky. Claire stood on the porch with Lily, breathing in the cold air. Ethan joined her, handing her his scarf. "For the wind," he said. She took it. Their fingers brushed. "Thank you," she said again. But this time the words meant more. Winter still held the land in its grip. The road out was buried. Time had slowed to the pace of snowfall and breath. And somewhere between the silence and the storms, something new was beginning to take root. Careful, cautious, but real. The road stayed buried. Days passed without the sound of engines or distant voices. The world narrowed to snow, breath, and the quiet labor of surviving winter. The radio crackled once with static and half-words before falling silent again. Even time felt slower, measured not by clocks but by fires fed and diapers changed, and light shifting across the floor. Claire settled into the house the way snow settles into low places, gradually, cautiously, until it belonged. She began to hum again as she cooked, soft melodies with no clear beginning or end. She learned which floorboard near the sink complained the loudest and stepped over it without thinking. She placed Lily's things neatly in a small basket by the stove, close to warmth. At night, when the wind rose, she no longer startled awake at every sound. Ethan noticed all of it. He noticed how Lily smiled now, a real smile, wide and unguarded, as if she'd decided the world might be worth trusting after all. He noticed how Claire's laughter came easier, though it still surprised her when it escaped. He noticed the way she stood on the porch each morning, squinting into the white distance like she was learning how to imagine a future again. One afternoon, as Ethan split wood behind the barn, he heard her voice. "Ethan?" He turned. She stood a few yards away, Lily bundled against her, her breath visible in the cold air. "Can I see it?" she asked. "The barn?" he said. She nodded. Her grip tightened slightly on the baby. Ethan hesitated only a moment, then set the axe down. All right. They walked together, slow. The barn door creaked open, familiar and hollow. The smell of hay and animals rushed out, unchanged. Claire stopped just inside the threshold. Her eyes flicked around the space, landing on the far corner where she'd been sleeping that first morning. Her shoulders stiffened, breath catching. Ethan waited, didn't speak. After a long moment she took a step forward, then another. She crossed the barn deliberately, like someone walking into a memory and refusing to let it swallow her whole. "I was so tired," she said quietly. "I didn't even hear the horses." "You were safe," Ethan said. They knew it. She smiled faintly at that, then looked down at Lily. "This is where you were, little one," she whispered. "This is where we got lucky." Ethan watched her carefully. "You don't have to come back in here again," he said. "Not if you don't want to." She shook her head. "I needed to." They stood there in silence, winter light filtering through the slats, dust floating like frozen stars. When they left, Claire reached back and closed the door herself. That night the snow began again, soft this time, almost gentle. They sat at the table together after dinner, Lily asleep nearby. The lantern cast warm circles of light, pushing the shadows back just enough. "The roads will open eventually," Claire said, staring into her mug. "When they do, I should go." The words were careful, prepared, but they trembled anyway. Ethan nodded. "I know." Silence stretched between them. "I don't want to disappear," she added. "I just don't know where we belong yet." Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, the woman who had arrived frozen and afraid, who now filled his house with quiet life. "You belong wherever you choose to stay," he said. "And you don't have to choose tonight." Her eyes glistened. She reached across the table without thinking, her hand finding his. It fit there like it had been waiting. Winter deepened, weeks passed. The storm cycle broke and returned, broke again. Lily grew heavier in his arms when he held her, more solid, more present. Claire began to talk about plans, not certainties, just possibilities. Work she might find, places she might go. Ethan listened, and waited. The morning the plow finally came through, carving a narrow path down the road. The sound was so unfamiliar, it startled them both. Claire stood at the window, heart pounding, Lily on her hip. "Well," she said softly, "there it is." Ethan nodded. "It'll be easier now." She turned to him, searching his face. "I don't want easy," she said. "I want real." He swallowed. "So do I." They stood there, the moment heavy and delicate all at once. Outside, winter still ruled the land, but the way forward was visible now. Claire took a breath. "If we stay," she said slowly, "it wouldn't be because we're trapped. It would be because we choose it." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "That's the only way it should be." She smiled then, a full, steady smile. "Then I choose this. I choose here," Lily babbled, like she approved. Ethan laughed softly, emotion thick in his throat. He stepped closer, resting his forehead against Claire's. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing the same air. "You're home now," he said again, but this time the words meant something deeper. Shared. Spring would come eventually, roads would thaw, the world would widen again. But winter had already done its work. It had stripped them down to what mattered, had brought them together in silence and snow, had asked nothing but honesty and endurance. And in the quiet after the storm, in a farmhouse warmed by fire and presence, a man, a woman, and a child began a life not born of rescue or desperation, but of choice.